So far, we've talked about projection, we've talked about switching, and now we have the last and final component, and that's reactivity. So what is reactivity? So far, we've formed all of our KPIs in question form. So the question here is, how efficient are we on the ground? And really, if we're talking about efficiency and being effective on the ground, then it really comes down to ground contact time. So how much time do we spend on the ground? That is our KPI here. So if we look at this run here, and we look at the graph from this run, we know that as we get faster, as we go further and further into a sprint, our ground contact time should decrease. If we look at this, we can see with every step, our ground contact time should gradually decrease. And actually, ground contact time and air time have an inverse relationship. So as my ground contact time goes down, my air time should increase. And we see here it's only a 20-yard run, so that's why it's a very, very slow, gradual decrease. But if we look at ground contact time, we can see as every step, or with every step, our ground contact time decreases. So if we look at this study, which is a very interesting study, they took elite sprinters and compared them to team sport athletes. So the elite sprinters in this case were national team, New Zealand national team sprinters compared to rugby players. And they really wanted to look at some of the differences between these elite sprinters and these team sport athletes to get an idea of what are some things that we can kind of take from track and field or take from sprinters and then apply it to speed development for team sport athletes. And we can see some of the factors that played a role here. Obviously, the elite sprinters were faster. I think everybody expected that. But some of the other things that played a role here, we look at contact time. So again, ground contact time, right? That played a very likely large difference in the speed or the outcome between the elite sprinters and the team sport athletes. And we go all the way down to vertical stiffness. So now we can start asking some questions here. We see that the elite sprinters were faster. We also see that they spent less time on the ground. So that's our first question. How are they able to run faster while spending less time on the ground? So that tells us the answer is they were able to produce more force in a shorter amount of time on the ground. So they were more efficient, coming back to our KPI, more efficient with the time that they spent on the ground. And then we look at vertical stiffness, which also played a relatively large role in the difference. Vertical stiffness, and we look at vertical stiffness and try to define it. What is that? That's basically, when we talk about stiffness, being able to avoid deformation. Okay? So we've heard of ankle stiffness. That's definitely a huge thing that plays a big role. But if we're talking about stiffness in linear sprinting and speed development, then we're really talking about system stiffness. So our system comprises of three joints: our ankle or our foot, our knee, and our hip. Okay, those are the three joints that we need to be stiff if we want to be efficient with the time that we spend on the ground. Okay, that's system stiffness. So if we had to define stiffness, again, can you resist deformation in the foot, knee, and hip? And there's a picture of a spring here because that's one of the easiest ways to think about it. If you think about a spring that's extremely tough to push in, right, that is a stiff spring compared to a spring that is really easy to push in. We would call that compliant, okay, a compliant spring. So one thing that's extremely important is that strong athletes have a huge responsibility when it comes to developing stiffness. Okay, so with great power comes great responsibility. And we see that here in this example. This is an athlete that is crazy strong. Right? I know for a fact that this athlete has a trap bar deadlift max of 250 kilos. For people in America, 550 pounds, just multiply by 2.2, seriously. But this athlete is extremely strong. But if we take a look at his left foot when he goes to make a step in this acceleration, we can see we lose a lot of energy. It's extremely compliant. It collapses. And now we can start to really ask questions. So when you see something like this, we have to start figuring out or asking the question, what could be a reason why it's like that? And especially if we look at the other side, the right side, and see that it's able to remain relatively stiff, well, now we have a difference. There's a discrepancy there between left and right. So now we have to start asking questions. Why could that be? And again, just to kind of drive that point home, right, if we want more displacement, and this is obviously talking about vertical displacement, just displacement in general, whether it's vertical or horizontal, we need stiffness. Okay? Stiffness gives us more displacement. So how do we start to see stiffness? Well, again, we look at those three joints, okay? The knee, the hip, and the foot. Sorry, I went out of order there, right? But foot, knee, hip. Those are the 3 joints that I look at. The reason why I said knee first is because in my coach's eye, that's what I go to first. All right, it's one of the easiest things for me to see. So we can see here with this run, all right, we're looking at the knee. And I want to see if there's a change in the angle there. Is there any compliance there? Does it deform? And I'm also going to look at the hip. Okay, so I'm looking at deformation in the hip, but really I'm looking at the height of the hip. So does our hip sink, or are we able to stay relatively high? So if I drew a line, this athlete was drawing a line with their hips, right? We want the line to stay relatively constant. Not that it comes up, goes down, comes up, goes down, okay? Because that lets us know that our hip is sinking, right? But we want the line to stay relatively constant. So here's a drill that I use with athletes. And this gives me a lot of information, but it's also a great intervention. So here we see the athlete with the left side, we're able to stay relatively stiff. Okay, so we have a quicker ground contact time. We can see that through the foot, the knee, and the hip, we're able to stay pretty stiff. Whoops. And if we go to the other side, the right side, we see in the knee, there's a lot of deformation there. There's a lot of compliance there. Okay, we're not able to stay stiff. So again, we're asking questions. Left side looks great. Right side doesn't look great. All right, sometimes maybe good, sometimes maybe, right? But again, we have to ask questions of why is it like that? What could be a reason behind this discrepancy here? And again, if we're running fast, or the faster that we're running, right, the more stiffness we need, the more stiffness that we have, the faster we can run. So it's a give and take here. It's just like an ongoing cycle. So how can we start to train for stiffness, for this reactivity here? All right, well, we need a combination of things. We need muscle stiffness and we need tendon stiffness. So if we're talking about muscle stiffness, we can look at things like eccentric training. So if we just go through our slides here, all right, we see we have an eccentric rear foot elevated split squat, a very basic eccentric bilateral squat. We can even get creative with our plyometrics here. And then we have things like our altitude drops, drop landings, however you want to call it. Right? On top of that, we need tendon stiffness. So that's where we turn to things like our overcoming isometrics. And the thing about overcoming isometrics is that it is very joint specific. So we always have to refer back to our SAID principle. So it's going to be joint specific. And that's why we see in the first slide here, if I'm really working on an acceleration, then I'm going to choose an acceleration biased position here. Second slide and the third slide is going to be more upright running bias, just working on a overcoming isometric calf raise and an overcoming isometric knee raise. Right? Again, just working on different positions. And then finally, we look at some of our plyometrics. Okay, so any of our pogo variations, any of our drop jumps, any kind of reactive jumps, those are going to be things that we can use as well. One side note here, not every athlete is naturally elastic. Right? I am not one of those athletes. I'm not naturally elastic. I spent probably a couple of hours filming these jumps and had to do a lot of takes. And the next day, my tendon, specifically my Achilles tendon, was on fire. So when it comes to programming things like this, we do need to take that into consideration, and we just need to ramp things up so that everything needs to have progression.